There's been a lot of talk this week about weird things like lockdowns and a yucky plague-like virus. It reminds me of similar things that happened in the Bible times. There were a few lockdowns in the Bible. The first one went for a whole year when Noah and his family were in the ark. But there was a time in the Bible when people had to stay inside for just one night to protect them from a dangerous plague. The story goes back to Egypt when the people of Israel were being held as slaves for Pharaoh. God sent Moses to tell Pharaoh to let his people leave Egypt and go to worship him in the desert, but Pharaoh wouldn't do it. In order to free the people from Egypt, God sent plagues on the Egyptians, starting with a plague of blood. The water in the Nile filled with blood, so no one could drink it. All the fish in the Nile died, and people had to dig holes beside the Nile to find fresh water. Pharaoh asked Moses to make it stop, but when it did, Pharaoh still wouldn't let the Israelites go. So along came a second plague, frogs. It was disgusting. The frogs were everywhere. When the plague stopped, there were so many dead frogs they shoveled them into huge piles and it was stinking. But Pharaoh still didn't let the Israelites go. So next came a plague of gnats, tiny little insects everywhere. Pharaoh's magicians had been able to copy the first two plagues, but they couldn't copy this one. They said this is the finger of God. Even so, it wasn't enough to make Pharaoh give in. Next came a horrible plague of flies. The flies didn't go to the area of Goshen, where the Israelite slaves lived, but everyone else had to put up with them. All the government officials got sick of the flies in their houses, and this was enough for Pharaoh to try to make a deal with Moses. He said, "Worship God here instead of leaving the country." But that wasn't going to work. Moses prayed for the plague to stop, and it did, but Pharaoh still didn't let the people go. Then there was a plague on the livestock, that's the cows. The livestock belonging to the Egyptians died. Next Moses said, God is going to send a plague of hail. Many of the Egyptians believed him and put their animals inside. There was terrible hail in Egypt, and it ruined the flax and the barley crops that were ready for harvest. Pharaoh finally admitted that he had sinned, said to the Israelites they could leave, but then changed his mind once the hail stopped. The government officials started to get really fed up, so Pharaoh offered a huge compromise. He said the men could leave, but not the women and children. Moses turned down this deal. God sent a plague of locusts, and the locusts ate everything that was left in Egypt, the leaves on the trees and the budding crops. Pharaoh relented and asked God to take it away, but he later changed his mind yet again. Then came a plague of darkness. Everywhere in Egypt, except where the Israelites lived, was dark for 3 days. Pharaoh was getting desperate and said they could leave if they left their animals behind, but Moses said no. Pharaoh got so mad, he told Moses he never wanted to see his face again, and that if he did, he'd kill him. And now we get to the lockdown. There was one more terrible plague to come. God told Moses that an angel of death would pass through Egypt one night, killing every firstborn male in Egypt. There was one thing they could do to protect themselves. Every family had to find a lamb, a perfect lamb, that had nothing wrong with it. They had to go and get it on the date of the 10th of Nisan. That's a day in the Jewish calendar. And then on the date of the 14th of Nisan, they had to take this beautiful, perfect animal and kill it when the sun went down. Then, in what must have made everyone in the house very sad, they had to take the blood of that lamb and put it on the door jamb of the door of their house. They packed and got ready to leave Egypt that night. They had to lock down inside their homes, roast the lamb that they had killed, and eat it. They had to make bread made without yeast because they had no time for it to rise. They ate fast and got ready to leave. That night, on the 14th of Nisan, the angel of death passed through Egypt. But God protected the people who were in homes with blood on the doorposts and did not allow the destroyer to enter it. Every firstborn male in Egypt, both human and animal, who was not protected by the blood died that night. There was terrible wailing in Egypt that night, and during the night, Pharaoh called for Moses and told him to take the Israelites out of the country right away. They left straight away. God made a law that the Israelites had to remember that night, called the Passover, once a year on the 14th of Nisan, which this year for us would fall on the 8th of April. This is exactly what Jesus was doing when he and the disciples met and ate the Passover meal in the upper room in Jerusalem. We know this night as the Last Supper. Here Jesus showed that his blood would be used for an even greater rescue than the original Passover. In the first Passover, the blood of one lamb could protect one family, but when Jesus died on the cross at Passover, his blood was able to save all mankind, past, present, and future. And just like the Israelites who were shut in their houses, trusting in the blood of the Passover lamb to protect them, we can put our faith in Jesus. We do this by thanking Jesus for the sacrifice he made on the cross and trusting in him to save us. So while you're stuck in your house today, you might want to look up this story in the Bible. It's in the book of Exodus with the Passover night story written in chapter 11. That's the big number on the page.